Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. For today's video, I wanted to cover all of the news that's happening regarding the California primary elections that's going to be occurring later tonight here on June 2nd, 2026 in the state of California. So on your screen, you can actually see this article here from The Guardian where they're going over the California primary elections and stating how this is going to be one of the most turbulent and one of the most chaotic California primary elections in recent state history, at least going back for a few decades. Now, the reasoning behind this is because this is one of the most packed gubernatorial primary races for deciding who's going to be the governor of California here in the 2026 election, and there are multiple other races coinciding with this at the exact same time. It mentions here in this article that you have the Los Angeles mayoral election, which is one of the biggest cities in the entire country. So this mayoral race has implications nearly at the same size of New York City back in 2025 when Mamdani ended up winning that New York City mayoral race. This Los Angeles mayoral election is probably going to be the second most important mayoral election that could happen in the country, especially since this is also Los Angeles and it's probably more competitive than New York City would be for more so moderate Democrats or moderate Republicans. So going back to this article, besides the Los Angeles mayor race that's going alongside the governor's primary, you also have a couple of congressional races here that, because of California's top two primary system, where all of the parties are listed on the same primary ballot and two Republicans or two Democrats can come out instead of one Republican and one Democrat, a system that Democrats in California specifically designed to lock out Republicans from their races and be able to choose their preference of Democrats, could come back and end up biting them in the back, because some of these Republicans are actually going to potentially lock out Democrats because of how many Democrats are in the race. So let's go ahead and start off with the most important race here, which is the California governor's race. So you can actually see here in the San Francisco Chronicle article here that there are multiple candidates running for the gubernatorial election here in California. You have Xavier Becerra from the state of California. You have Steve Hilton, who is the Republican frontrunner right now in the polls. You have Tom Steyer, which is a multi-billionaire. You have Katie Porter. You have Chad Bianco, among many others, running for the office of governor of California. Now, a lot of these candidates have had their debates. They've had a lot of chances to make their voices heard. And essentially, it is split on the Republican side between Steve Hilton and Chad Bianco, where Steve Hilton at this point is the clear frontrunner and is in the lead and is most likely going to make it to the runoff. Whereas for the Democrats, it's really been somewhat of a tight contest between Xavier Becerra and Tom Steyer, where Becerra has taken the lead ever since Swalwell dropped out. But Tom Steyer in a few polls shows a chance that he could end up squeaking out a runoff election here. If he doesn't get first place, that he might even possibly get second place and lock out Republicans from this governor's race. So let's actually go to some of the polls here that we have for the gubernatorial election. Back to what I was saying, you can actually see the multitude of candidates here. Now, most of these candidates are no-name candidates. Like you actually have someone called Barack Obama Shaw. So, just showing the amount of candidates here that we have on the Democratic Party. But you have around, 23, 24 Democrats that are going to be running on the primary side for them. And you have about 12 or 13 Republicans that are running. However, most of these candidates don't actually have ballot access and aren't actually going to show up on your piece of paper when you go to vote. So most of these candidates could be throwaways, but you do have a few front runners in the Democratic side. As mentioned, you have Xavier Becerra, you had Tom Steyer, and most recently, Katie Porter and Matt Mahan kind of fell out of the limelight. Whereas Republicans, it's really just a two-way contest between Chad Bianco and Steve Hilton, where Steve Hilton has already taken the lead quite significantly and has left Chad Bianco down in the dust. So let's go down to the actual polls we have for the primary. So if you go down over here, you can actually see that the two frontrunners right now is Xavier Becerra and Steve Hilton. And the one that's coming in at third place is actually Tom Steyer. Now, Tom Steyer, at first, at some points right after Eric Swalwell dropped out, was seen as a frontrunner. You can see here that in a few polls, once Swalwell dropped out, Tom Steyer was picking up those voters and leading at 14, 15, 16%. However, as more and more people dropped out, including Yee and Swalwell, some of those voters, and as more Democrat voters actually began to, decide who they want to support, they're kind of all throwing their backing behind Xavier Becerra, which is why Tom Steyer went from, definitely making the runoff, if not getting first place, to now potentially not making the runoff and potentially making it to third place. So this is really going to be an interesting competition, because even some Democrat left-leaning polls here, specifically this one sponsored by Tom Steyer, actually shows that Tom Steyer will make the runoff in second place and that Steve Hilton won't even make the runoff election. So that's interesting, but at least right now of the polling aggregate, it looks like this will be a two-way race between Xavier Becerra and Steve Hilton when all the votes are said and done and they're all counted. And Tom Steyer will, unfortunately for him, be falling probably at third place. But if there was any candidate to make the runoff that would make an upset, it would be Tom Steyer here, because he is the only one close enough. And as you can see, 90% of all the voters have already made up their mind. Now, there's around 10% of the voters undecided. And you can see here that the Republicans combine for around 33%. So probably half of those 10% of voters are going to go to Steve Hilton or Chad Bianco. But there is another 5% of Democrat voters there that could end up going to Tom Steyer if he gets the boost that he wants, or will most likely be spread out among many of the other Democrat candidates when they do decide who they want to vote for. So for the gubernatorial race that's happening later tonight, my prediction will be that Steve Hilton will get first place in the primary. I think Chad Bianco has really been left in the dust here after Donald Trump endorsed Steve Hilton instead of Chad Bianco. And because of this, I think Steve Hilton will probably get around what the poll suggests here, maybe 22 to 25% of the primary vote. Chad Bianco will probably be around maybe 10% of the vote. And for the second place, I think it's going to be one of the Democrats. I think here in this race, it will be Xavier Becerra. His polling lead right now of winning by around 4 percentage points. I think because of Swalwell dropping out and all of the Democrats dropping out in this race, a lot of the Latino vote ended up coalescing behind him, coincidentally, after all of those people ended up dropping out. And unfortunately for Tom Steyer, I think he will not be making the runoff, although I think this might be a little bit closer. He does have a possible chance of an upset. However, my final prediction for the race that's going to occur later tonight is that it will be Xavier Becerra and Steve Hilton going to a runoff. And it will not be a lockout for Democrats or Republicans. It will be a Democrat versus a Republican here in a general election by the time November comes. So that's my official prediction for the governor's race. However, the governor's race is not the only election we wanted to cover here. We actually have another election, which is the Los Angeles mayoral election. Now, for those of you who remember, back in 2022, former Congresswoman Karen Bass ran for the mayor of Los Angeles, where she ended up beating a more moderate Democrat, Rick Caruso, here by approximately 9 percentage points. Now, Karen Bass is seen as more left-wing because she was a former Democratic Congresswoman, and Rick Caruso was sort of a more moderate, quote-unquote, Democrat running here in the race, where he wanted to promise to clean up and make changes in Los Angeles, whereas Karen Bass is seen as more so of an establishment figure for the Democrat Party here in the city of Los Angeles, and she ended up winning the runoff election. And you can also see in the runoff election that most people don't even vote in the primary, that they all end up voting in the runoff. So there was only 640,000 people who voted in the primary election in 2022. However, once you go to the actual runoff, there was over 929,000 votes. So that is around a 40% increase from the primary to the runoff, which is why a lot of the polls ended up narrowing out. Because you can see here that Karen Bass ended up winning by 8 percentage points, but all of the other Democrats that are even more left-wing ended up combining by around 15 to nearly 20 points. So you would think that Karen Bass, by the time the runoff happens, she would win by double digits or 12, 15 points, but she only ended up winning by around 9 percentage points. So I think that's a bit more interesting how in the runoff it seems like a lot more moderate or maybe working class or working or conservative voters ended up showing up for the runoff election, where they indeed did not vote for the primary election. So that's something interesting here. But going back to this current election, it really is a three-way race between only three people. The incumbent mayor, Karen Bass. You have a city councilor, Nithya Raman, apologies if I mispronounced her name, who is a city councilor for the city of Los Angeles, and she was seen as a protege of Karen Bass. She actually supported Karen Bass in the past. You can see here that she literally endorsed her before deciding to go back on her endorsement and run against Karen Bass. And she's seen as the more extreme socialist type, where Karen Bass is more so an establishment Democrat here. And then you have Spencer Pratt, who is a celebrity and reality TV star, who is running as more so the centrist candidate here, where on paper he is a member of the Republican Party. However, because he's running in Los Angeles, he's really trying to downplay his party registration here and run as more so of a working class and centrist candidate here, trying to coalesce a lot of independents and Democrats in this race, because he knows if he just runs as a full-on Republican, he will lose. So that's where the race currently stands. It is a three-way race between these three, where you sort of have a centrist Republican, a establishment Democrat, and a left-wing socialist city councilor here, who's also running as a Democrat. So let's go to what the polls are actually saying. You can see here that Karen Bass has been pretty much guaranteed to go to a runoff in all of these polls because she is either in first place or nearly edging out first place, almost becoming second place. In this most recent UC Berkeley/Los Angeles Times poll, you can actually see that Nithya Raman is at 25% and Karen Bass is only at 26%, which means the incumbent mayor is only about 1% above her own city councilwoman who's running against her. However, I think that poll is more so of an outlier when you look at all of the other ones. But one thing you will find interesting here is that Spencer Pratt, despite him running as a conservative or more so moderate instead of a Democrat, is able to pull off enough support here to be pretty much going to a runoff election. You can see that he started off at around 10 percentage points where he's now averaging around the low 20s. And Karen Bass is literally an incumbent mayor and she's only averaging 25%, which really goes to see how unpopular she is in the city of Los Angeles and how poor of a job she has done. Now, you might be wondering, oh, what's the poor job she's done and what's all of the scandals. You can actually go back, and if you remember early 2025, right as Donald Trump was being inaugurated, Karen Bass and the state of California as a whole was facing a massive wildfire event where the Palisades fire ended up claiming hundreds, if not thousands, of people's homes, where thousands of families had their home destroyed or set ablaze on fire, which ended up, affecting tens of thousands of people, potentially even hundreds of thousands of people because of all the evacuations. And upon this event happening, there was a lot of scandals regarding the fire department, the police response, the emergency response, the mayor's office, why they weren't able to use water to put out some of the fires. And this led to an entire recall effort happening at the beginning of 2025 in the aftermath of this fire. Now, the recall effort did have a bit of steam for a few months and a bunch of signatures and a lot of money going into it for a short time period right after the fires. But after a few months and the scandal kind of died down, the recall effort ended up not actually making it to the ballot, despite them getting millions of dollars and a lot of momentum at the time because of how unpopular Karen Bass was, because Karen Bass had actually planned a trip to Africa where she decided to travel to Ghana while her own city was burning in flames, which ended up giving a lot of people a sour taste in their mouth because their own mayor decided to leave them during a troubling time. And besides that, you can actually see that Spencer Pratt was able to get Donald Trump's endorsement here in the Los Angeles mayoral race. For Trump, it's probably dumb and unwise to try to endorse a centrist candidate in a city like LA, where LA, the majority of them vote Democrat and don't like Trump to begin with, and he's endorsing someone who's running as a centrist candidate, sort of trying to run away from his Republican registration, and Trump comes out of nowhere to endorse in a local mayoral race. But you can actually see Spencer Pratt has enough steam here. He's getting news coverage. He's getting endorsements from Republican Party members, Democrat Party members, independent members, while at the same time trying to run as a independent himself when in reality he is a registered Republican. So it's going to be a race that is left to be determined because it really relies on how Spencer Pratt is able to outrun and push away his Republican registration to all of these voters when it comes to voting on the ballot. Luckily enough for him, on the LA mayoral election, on the actual paper ballot when you go to vote, it does not tell the voters if you are Democrat, Republican, or Independent. It just tells them if they're an incumbent mayor. So they're going to see Karen Bass listed as an incumbent, but they're not actually going to know that Spencer Pratt is a registered Republican unless they do their own research and read all of these news articles. So Spencer Pratt seems to have the momentum on his side for the time being, where Karen Bass is doing a really poor job as an incumbent mayor who has the fundraising advantage here with around $3 million, only being at 25%. She only has a quarter of the vote despite being mayor of Los Angeles for 4 entire years, which is incredibly poor. And once again, a lot of this goes back to the scandal that happened, which is why her unpopularity seems to be a factor in this vote. Now, we just talked about the governor's election and the LA mayoral election. I think in the LA mayoral election, we're not going to see any winner here because it's going to most likely be Karen Bass going to a runoff against Spencer Pratt, in my opinion. I think that Karen Bass is really underperforming right now and she will not clear 50%, obviously, because she was polling at 25%. And we will end up seeing Spencer Pratt going up against Karen Bass later this summer. My prediction for the mayoral election, now that we've looked at the polls, I think that Karen Bass will definitely be making it to the runoff. However, she is performing extremely poorly only at around 25% as an incumbent mayor. I think she will be facing off most likely against Spencer Pratt, who seems to be surging at the right time because he's around 22 to 23 percentage points here. I think that Spencer Pratt, by the time the runoff comes, would really need to do an astonishing job if he wants any chance of beating Karen Bass while remaining a registered Republican, despite the voters not knowing that on their ballot. So I think Spencer Pratt needs to do an extraordinary job for himself and keep all of the momentum running for another almost 5 months if he does want to win. He would probably lose in a general election, but at the current time, I can see him going to the runoff against Karen Bass. So that's it for the Los Angeles mayoral election. Now, the most interesting part of this video, I think, will be the early vote counts. So here on your screen, we actually have a tracker for the return ballots in the state of California for the primaries. You can actually see that in the state of California, no matter what your preference is, they mail all of the voters registered in that state their mail-in ballot to their home address. So all of these people registered by party, whether they are independent, another party, a third party, Republican or Democrat, they all get their ballots mailed to them. And you can actually see the percentage of them that have been returning their primary vote and actually voting. And in a state like California, where Democrats outnumber Republicans by more than 2 to 1, you can actually see that Democrats are only about 30% ahead of Republicans instead of 100% ahead of Republicans. Or because Democrats outnumber Republicans 2 to 1, they should really be closer to around a 2 million return voter mark compared to Republicans' 1 million return ballot mark. And of course, there are the third parties here in the state of California. Now, you don't want to assume that the independents in California are more moderate or right-wing. In a state like California, it's probably safe to assume a lot of those independents and third parties are probably, leftist, socialist party members or Green Party members. Out of all of the states, California probably would be the state where a good chunk of their independent or other voters are probably tied or aligned with some of those parties. But of course, you would assume that those voters, a decent amount of them, probably not as much as some other states, would end up voting Republican, although not many. Now, another thing that Republicans have going for them is that males are actually pretty caught up with the female vote here in the primary election, where males are somewhat returning their ballots at the same rate of females. Usually, women outvote men in the United States by around, 5 to 6 percentage points, where if you look at any exit poll in any election, you would see that typically on any given election, it's around 52% female and 46% male, with around 2% undetermined or non-binary or some other identification that they want to put for their gender. However, here in the state of California, you can see that females only have a 2% lead when it comes to going against men, which is typically about 4% better than what men usually do when it comes to actual elections. So the fact there are more men voting, the fact that there are more Republicans returning compared to previous elections and not as many Democrats returning their ballots compared to previous elections is a promising sign for the Republican Party. That's why I mentioned earlier I can see Steve Hilton getting first place and making it to the runoff, because Republicans are doing a decent job turning out here, especially when compared to previous years. And they have two more factors going for them. Look at the demographics of the people who are actually returning their ballots. The majority of them are 65 plus, retired, seniors, senior citizens, the most active voting base that typically in most recent elections align with Republicans. Of course, in the state of California, they definitely lean left and align more with Democrats. But think about it, compared to 18 and 20-year-olds, these seniors in their 65 plus years are definitely going to be more conservative than the youth vote here. And the youth vote is very, very low at only around 300,000 or less, whereas the senior vote is at 1.6 million. And the majority of Republicans in the state of California are white. Typically, they're not Asian, they're not Latino, they're definitely not African American voters in the state of California. So these are really the demographics and the numbers that Republicans would be hoping for in this election. Now, of course, California does outnumber Republicans 2 to 1, where Democrats are definitely going to be in the lead. And despite Republicans doing a decent job at their early game, returning these ballots in the primary election, they are still at a disadvantage, although not at the worst place that they could possibly be. So that's why I really find this interesting, and I think that Republicans could have a chance when it comes to that LA mayoral race later in the year, and I think they have enough votes for Steve Hilton to make it to the runoff. So I still think Republicans will lose both of those elections. When it comes to Spencer Pratt, I do think he'll lose in the runoff, and I also think Steve Hilton will lose in the runoff. However, based off these primary statistics, I do think, Republicans will have their candidate advancing to a runoff, which for their scenario is probably the most that they could ask for to begin with. Finally, to end off this video, I wanted to go over two congressional House races here that I think are very important. So if you recall earlier in this video, I mentioned how California has a unique top two primary system where both Democrats, Republicans, and third parties all show up on the exact same primary ballot, where everyone gets to vote regardless of party, and whichever two candidates get the most votes are the ones that advance to either a runoff election, or in this case for Congress, advance to a general election in November. And there are two races that are pretty much safe and solid Democrat here in the state of California, where Democrats completely screwed themselves over because of arrogance and refusing to drop out. So the first one here is District 48, where if we can count here, we have one Democrat, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Democrats all running on the same primary ballot, along with an independent with no party preference who is a leftist. So you probably have around 10 Democrats here running in this primary against only 1 and 2 Republicans. And you can see here that Republicans, because they're only splitting their vote in two, let's say if there's only 40% of the district is Republican, if they split it evenly, 20% and 20%, they can definitely both make it to the general election, because if there are 60% Democrats and they're splitting it between 10 candidates at 6% each, they are well below 20%. And you can actually see this somewhat in the polling, where if you go down to the polling, it shows that Democrats are actually being locked out of the election, where it's actually 2 Republicans advancing. So when you go to the Survey USA polls here, that is actually not partisanly sponsored, it shows 2 Republicans advancing every time. You can see here that Jim Desmond and Kevin Patrick O'Neill, in the most recent Survey USA poll from May and from the one back in April, both appear to be advancing to the general election, whereas Democrats are splitting their votes way too thin to even show up for November. Now, of course, there are still 20 to 25% undecided. Presumably, most of them will be Democrats. But if they do want to make sure a Democrat wins in November, they need to coalesce around one candidate, because if all 20% of the voters spread their votes out evenly, the Republicans will be able to abuse the system and get both of their candidates to the top, despite Republicans probably going to be outvoted here, 45 to 55 or 40 to 60 here. So this is one instance where the Democrat system here in the state of California could come back to bite them, and they could be screwed over. The second instance here is actually in District 6. So for those of you who haven't heard the news, Kevin Kiley, a registered Republican, who was formerly registered as Republican, decided to leave the Republican Party and register as an independent. Now, this is a scheme where Kevin Kiley is still caucusing and working with all of the Republicans and voting with all of the Republicans, but he dropped the Republican label to go for it as an independent to try to convince and or trick voters in the district into voting for him, because they see that he is not a registered Republican anymore. Now, he is the incumbent in the district, and the reason he did that is because he wants the Republican Party to have a chance here with the only Republican in the race, Michael Stansfield, running, which means that there is an independent and a Republican going against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Democrats. So once again, this is a scenario where Democrats are favored to win, but because the Democrats are splitting their votes between 5 people, and the Republicans who know are voting for Kevin Kiley, and Republicans who just see the letter R next to Michael's name will be voting for Michael, Republicans might be able to do enough to once again abuse the system and advance both of their candidates to the general election, despite Democrats probably getting the majority of the vote here. Now, you can actually somewhat see this in the polling. Now, this is a partisanly sponsored Democrat poll, so of course they want to, artificially boost and inflate the Democrat numbers here. But they show that there's only one Democrat at around 18%, but Michael Stansfield at the current time is failing to make his name seen enough to the point that he's able to advance to the general election. However, if you open up the hypothetical polling here, at a different poll, at an earlier point in time, Republicans were actually going to lock out the Democrats here, where you had 2 Republicans advancing to the general election here. So I think if Republicans end up splitting their vote evenly between Kevin Kiley and Michael, and Democrats split their votes evenly, the Democrats could end up screwing themselves over. My official prediction here is I think for both District 6 and for District 48, that they're not going to happen. I think that enough Democrats will coalesce around one candidate. I find it very hard to see them voting between 10 people, but I think if it were to happen, it would probably happen in District 48. The reasoning behind that is there are just so many more Democrats running here. Like I mentioned, it is literally 10 Democrats against 2 Republicans. That's very, very hard for them to all coalesce around one, considering there's no major endorsements here. So I would probably say there's a 40% chance of it happening in District 48, and probably a 10% chance or a 20% chance of it happening in District 6. So I think best case scenario here, if Republicans have a good night, they might get one of these districts here locked out from Democrats, which is going to be huge implications here, because if you actually open up and you look at the pundits' predictions here, most of these have Republicans at 210 seats for November, 215 seats, 211 seats. And then when you go to the leftist, more inaccurate polls here by Race to the White House, The Economist, and VoteHub, where, funny enough, VoteHub actually gave up on their forecast entirely, and they're literally just sponsored by Kalshi, where they are, instead of conducting their own political analysis and their own predictions, they are literally just copying the numbers off gamblers on the internet to base their elections. So that's the way VoteHub's doing it, and that's why VoteHub has Republicans a bit lower than the actual reputable pundits here from Sabato's Crystal Ball, Inside Elections, and the Cook Political Report. So I think you could probably throw these 3 forecasts in the trash because they're way less accurate and way more biased toward one side. For the 3 I just mentioned, they all show Republicans at a good enough point where it might be possible, if Republicans win some of these toss-ups, which they probably are not going to do, but you have 2 things to consider, where you have, one, the fact that a Democrat might be locked out of this California race, and if that happens, that is a guaranteed win for the Republicans. That's going to boost this number by 1, and the fact that Alabama is redrawing their districts, and Louisiana is redrawing those districts, that in a few weeks, Republicans will have an automatic 2-seat gain in all of these predictions, where you would have it, instead of 215, you'd have Republicans at 217. And if they have 217, they literally just need 1 seat to gain the majority for the House of Representatives. And if that 1 seat does happen, it could possibly happen from a Democrat being locked out in California, which would just be an awful and bitter way for Democrats to lose a majority. Now, of course, I really doubt this would happen, but I do think, there is a universe where there is a 1% chance of all of these events occurring at the same time, which is something that Democrats ought to watch out for when they go to vote in this primary election. So with that being said, everyone, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and let me know what you guys think about the California primary election down below in the comments. If you live in the state of California and you voted in the primary, go ahead and comment down below who you decided to vote for, which candidates you think are going to win, and which candidate you are planning to vote for if they make it to the runoff election. Now, that's all I had for today's video, and I hope you all decide to subscribe and like the video, and stay tuned because I'll be making more videos later this week. Thank you, and I'll see you all in the next video.